Okay, good morning, everyone. Sorry I don't speak Portuguese, but first I'd like to thank Joan and everyone in the organizing committee for inviting me. It's a great honor. And I have a confession to tell you. I was a teenager in 1982 when Brazil lost the World Cup, and I cried. And a decade later, when Ayrton Senna died, I cried again. So I must have been Brazilian in a previous life. So this is my presentation. Okay, we may say that forensic science is in crisis, and we've heard about some of these reports. The NS report, there has been a PCAST report, similar reports in Canada, all over the world. It created a sense of kind of roadblock, a lot of tensions, a lot of different, I guess, advices and policy directions that sometimes, not necessarily coherent. And when we look at how this is portrayed in the media, it can be quite damaging. We see quite often things like junk science in the courtroom. As an aside, it's never junk science in the courtroom, it's more junk testimony in the courtroom, really. We may think it's only for entertainment, but actually some very reputable journals are claiming the same thing. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that these reports didn't identify very valid problems. But I'd like to come with a slightly different perspective and try to reanalyze a bit the whole thing, with a different angle, a different eye. So one problem with the ongoing negativity policy towards forensic science is quite often there is no real pragmatic solutions that are provided. And we have to admit that crime and security events will never stop. The administration of justice cannot stop until we are perfectly 100% foolproof on everything. So what's the alternative? We heard about eyewitness early this week, but confession, torture, really, it's kind of an interesting discussion. Now, what I'd like to do is to present a few anomalies and paradoxes in the current situation and try then to identify a way forward. And I'm not here to give, dictate lessons and things what to do, but it's just to try to open up a bit the mind of the audience. First anomaly, to me, there are different studies that have tried to see the efficiency of forensic science in the end-to-end process. Some estimations are that between only 10 to 20% of the materials recovered at the crime scene are submitted to the laboratory. Other studies or estimations show that only 5% of the materials examined by the lab end up in court. And then we have criminological studies or sociological studies who've looked at the effectiveness of forensic science, and quite often the results are very unclear. And quite often forensic science is seen as having a modest impact at best. So we could argue about the validity of some of these studies, but it shows kind of an interesting picture, because how can forensic science have such a dramatic role in miscarriage of justice when you look at these other studies? It kind of almost gives too much power in the hands of forensic science and forensic scientists in the end-to-end process compared to the reality. So it's kind of a bit of anomaly and paradox to me. Another one that I want to show you, this is what we call a crime funnel in criminology. So it's well known that the number of offenses, only a proportion of that are detected, less where it's, they are attended, collected, analyzed, presented in court. So you've got this sort of exponential decrease. What's interesting is when you look at the efforts, be in the lab, be it in the research, literature, commentators, most of the efforts are at that end of the spectrum. While when you look at this, quite clearly you can see that if forensic science wants to have a real impact or bigger impact, it has to be more effective at that end of the spectrum. So again, it's a kind of another anomaly and paradox to me. Now, another example I want to show you is something that was written by Carl in York, who was a senior police officer in the New South Wales Police Force in Australia. And that was at the back of the Australian New Zealand Forensic Science Society symposium in Sydney. So she presents a hypothetical case of an elderly woman coming back home and finding the house broken into, stuff stolen, etc. And she explains through the whole process what may or may not happen. So first she says, okay, you've got the neighbors coming, and then she runs to the phone, she calls the police, and at that stage the scene may or may not be disturbed. And then at the police, the call handler taking the report may or may not advise the reporter that they should preserve the scene and how they should do that. Then the police attend with or without some priority. And then when the police comes, the officer may or may not arrive sooner or later, may not collect some physical evidence, or they determine whether or not a crime scene examiner should attend, and the examiner may or may not be briefed about the offense. And then the crime scene examiner may arrive, and sooner or later, and then collect some physical or fingerprint evidence based on what they may or may not have been informed. And then again, there may be some evidence sent to the lab for analysis, but it may or may not be analyzed. It may or may not be done quickly, may or may not get a result. So what I'm trying to say here, you will agree that there is a huge level of variability and uncertainty in this whole system. And the various decisions that are taken at the various points can be very variable. And when we look at the system from the end to end again, the interesting thing is the scene and the generation of the traces at the scene is what's not controlled at all. We don't control that. It's a one-off. We know that when it goes to the trial of fact, again, it's not very well controlled. The middle bit, as for example Peter de Forest quite often call that part, is where it's extremely controlled. It's the best part of the whole system in terms of control. Now, again, interestingly, when you read these reports, they ask for more control in that middle bit, which is already is already at a very high level of control anyway. So we could ask the question, whether the systematic search for errors and control of uncertainty in testing lab and experts or focus on methods makes sense when you look at the whole process, from the beginning to the end of the process. Now, I hope that with these few examples, I showed you that there are a number of anomalies. Now, there is a sociologist of science called Thomas Kuhn, who wrote this book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And he talks about how we change paradigm. And we can't really fight one paradigm versus another. But what happens? You've got some anomalies in a system, in a paradigm. And quite often in the beginning, people think that they are simply outliers or simply small little problems, we can address them. But then we reach a point where we have so many of them that we are in a crisis. And then a new paradigm emerged. So I'm not saying this is completely the case in forensic science, but we can at least ask the question whether we are not on such a path with what we are experiencing at the moment. Now, probably the most dramatic example of that situation is what we call recently with my colleagues Owen Casey and Olivier Ribot, we talk about the Kodak syndrome in a recent article in Journal of Forensic Sciences, where we talk about digital transformations. And you look at the analogy with Kodak. So Kodak put cameras in the hand of people. So people could take their own photos. So that was already kind of removing the step of professionalization, if you want, of the photographer. Then people were still going to a Photoshop to get their photos developed. But Kodak also invented the first digital camera. And what happened, they thought that they would still have a business model where they would make money on the basis of selling prints, selling paper, and films. And they didn't realize that the future was simply photo sharing, digital photo sharing, Facebook and all the social media. And because of that, essentially, they committed suicide, so to speak. So again, the analogy is, we can see forensic science providers who started to do very simple transactional things. I give you this, you do a test, give me the result. So it's the first step of the analogy. Now we are wondering whether with the digital transformations that are occurring now in forensic science and in society, whether we are not going a bit in that direction again. So this is very important for the laboratories, because if they are not careful, they may lose their relevance in the future. So again, crisis. Now, what should be done? So again, I'm not here to give some ready-made solutions. But we can look a bit what people have said in the past and try to work from there. Along with a few people around the world, I'm a strong believer that we should go back to the roots of forensic science and try to see what can be used here and try to transpose that in the 21st century, because there are a lot of lessons that we've lost over the years. So first, Paul Kirk was very quick to realize that people were very focused on technical solutions, and we're not that interested anymore in fundamental principles. And that was already in 1963 in this seminal paper. I don't think we moved that much since then. And to put it a different way, the problem we have in forensic science is that we haven't been very good at expressing our own fundamental principles, or at least not having them generally accepted. And it's a real problem, and I have really to credit Sheila Willis, who is here, because she's been very, very active. It's something very close to her heart and my hearts and other people's hearts. The thing here is that it started with chemical, how do I go back? It started with analytical chemistry. When analytical sciences came to the fore, people started to look at forensic science through their discipline's eyes. And then the same thing happened with every other development. More recently, cognitive science, information technology, etc. Instead of looking at the problems and the questions through the forensic science prism. And because we are kind of a lightweight compared to the other big communities, each time a new community comes to forensic science, we are tilted, and we have to change to fit, this community. So I think it's a problem. And we can see the example now again with the change from the physical to the digital world. A lot of the discussion that are going on, and I look forward to, to listening to Zeno, a lot of the discussion that are going on now in the digital world, tend to reinvent the wheel that already happened in the broader forensic science community. Now, for example, when we had the physical world, you've got chemical analysis. The equivalent now, it's simply getting a digital device and try to get information from the digital device and traces from the digital device. So we have to know the limitations and so on. Now, the good old police informant, nowadays it's all the monitoring you can do on online platforms. It's not that we don't have fundamental principles. So we've got the Kirk's principles of individuality, which was the start of the basis of the discussion around source attributions. The follow-up from there was Kwan's thesis about inference of identity of source, and it's a stepping stone to what people would call nowadays, the evaluation framework for forensic science, especially when we talk about source. We've got the low causation principles. A lot of people think that it's just every contact leaves a trace, but actually it's more than that. If we translate what he said in French, we can see that he said much more than that, and he's really talking about activities, not only source. And when you read this very carefully, we can see that there is a probabilistic dimension to it. Again, it fits very well modern application of forensic science. When we look at the kind of framework we are seen as primarily an experimental science, and it's why there is a strong focus on methods and so on. Now, I'll try to put a different spin here. There is this professor of the University of Colorado at Boulder, Carol Cleland. She's a philosopher of science, she's a geologist, and so on. She was really very interested in these big questions about how did dinosaurs disappear and things like that. And she's talking about the asymmetry of time in causation. So she's saying that the future is underdetermined, while the past is overdetermined. So the way to overcome the underdetermination of the future is to apply experimental science. And it's why we have this search or testing for false positives and false negatives and so on. The way we circumvent the overdetermination or exploit the overdetermination of the past is by using historical science. So we've got plenty of traces, plenty of signs, but we have to find them and we have to analyze them in a way that we have to recognize them for what they are. And the big problem here is the recognition aspect, not necessarily the analysis aspect. So when we think what we do in forensic science, when we go to a crime scene and we look at traces that have been transferred in the past and trying to go back from the observations to what we think what happened, a bit like when you go to visit your doctor and you have symptoms and try to go from the symptoms to your medical conditions. Quite often there is more than one medical conditions for the same symptoms. So this is a process we call abduction. And this is really what we do in forensic science. So really, when you realize in forensic science, the historical paradigm or historical science paradigm fits better than the experimental science paradigm. And one thing very important that what Carol says is there is no hierarchy. One paradigm is not better than the other. It's different. So I think the confusion we have is we use tools and methods that have been developed in experimental science, but they are applied essentially in a historical science paradigm. And this confusion creates some of the problems we see nowadays. Actually, Carol Cleland explained that very well, but a few people before worked on this. So there is a book by Umberto Eco who talks about Charles Peirce and is where the first ideas around abduction were published with this famous abduction and analogy of Charles Peirce. So that's, again, the idea is really going from the observation to the reasons why you see these observations. And actually, there is even someone else who wrote something interesting, a professor in Italy who compared the work of a judge in the inquisitorial system with the work of a historian. And he realized that actually there are a lot of analogies. So again, we are in this sort of historical science paradigm. Another thing that should probably occur is a more generally acceptance of the fact that we should go from forensics, plural, to forensic science. And we published a paper on that, so I'm not going through all the details here, but the idea is that there is a science on its own right called forensic science. It's not only a patchwork of disciplines. And we need to develop our own models to provide a strategy to integrate technologies, but within our own model. And we need to engage more with policing, and we need a much stronger forensic science culture. Of course, we need more education and research, but again, what kind of education and what kind of research? So, in a forensic science culture. And that goes back to another thing which is quite important. Again, we have a strong focus on methods, and I understand why, but in the same time, from what I said before, I hope it gets a bit clearer now that, it's not only the methods. and we have to try to move the focus on the trace, which is this remnant of activity and presence that we find as a one-off, and it's been quite often transferred in a very imperfect manner, in a non-representative manner. So it's non-pristine, and this trace is very rich in information, and we can use this information in different processes. Obviously, the first one, which is quite common, is in investigation or in court, so that's kind of traditional application of forensic science, but more recently in intelligence, where we look at not only one case, but we look at multiple cases. And then we are not interested for prosecution, but we're interested to understand the phenomenon. So then we can inform policymakers what they should do about it. It's kind of a very phenomenological, like epidemiology in medicine, if you want. And where's the key of all that? Really the key, I know it's kind of obvious, but it's going back to the crime scene, because everything starts at the crime scene. But the problem is, too often crime scene is seen as a simple collection of material, and we just have to apply good checklists, avoid any cross-contaminations, and that will be fine. And there is even people who coin the term administrative objectivity. While actually forensic science crime scene should be something different. You know? It should be really in the proper scientific endeavor. A lot of scientific processes happening, cognitive processes happening in the head are very scientific, and it happens at the crime scene. It's not just only following a checklist. So really crime scene has to be integrated in terms of management within scientific scrutiny. Another thing that should probably happen is trying to move from very slow, as we do in forensic science, to something close to real time. And I'll go back to this little chart. And I think we do that very well with fingerprints and now digital evidence and so on, digital traces. We are a bit less good with this kind of traditional analytical methods. So really what we try to do is to bring that closer to the action so we can be more effective. And that's another thing that should happen in forensic science. And the concept is already applied. I mean, it started a long time ago, in terms of breath analyzers. But now we see that pretty much going all over the place in forensic science. Here there is a question, of timeliness versus the robustness of the information. That's obviously a question. But I think for me, the most important question is really we need to go beyond the technical debate. We can develop all these methods, it's fantastic, but we shouldn't stop at the technical conclusions. We should think about what's the purpose? Why are we doing this? What does it mean? What does the result mean? And especially now with digital traces, what do we do with the data? We can't keep up. It's going so fast. So why are you doing all this if we don't know what to do with the data in the end? Another thing which is quite interesting as well, because LOCA, many years ago, obviously, compared fingerprints to other types of forensic evidence. And it was at a time where fingerprints were a bit like DNA nowadays. It was like the gold standard. And it pretty much showed that the big power of forensic science is by combining all these traces. We shouldn't focus only on one, but we're trying to combine, because then we can combine the information. And the big advantage is criminals can't control everything they do. They can't control everything not to leave traces. At some stage, they will leave something. And even if they clean up, by cleaning up, they remove something. So it's by combining all that we can get a better result in forensic science. And the idea here is by trying to get, using a less specialized treatment of one type of trace is preferable to the specialized in-depth treatment of one type. So we go across the board, and again, it's very effective from a scientific and cost viewpoint. Another thing which happened in recent years, it's this move, from being a simple analyst to becoming a privileged observer. So Angeline made a fantastic presentation, and people in the lab doing drug analysis day in, day out, they see what's going on. You know, it's okay, it's not complete, it's truncated, but in the same time, if you collate all this information, they see what type of drug is coming up and so on. And you can repeat that sort of view in a lot of different angles. So a forensic scientist is not only the analyst, but a forensic scientist can be like a medical doctor when you have someone going with some symptoms and then you've got someone else coming with the same symptoms and then someone else coming with the same symptoms. A good doctor will join the dots and say, oh, we've got a cluster of a problem here. So again, forensic scientists have the potential to do that. So I'm mindful that there are a lot of technical limitations and probably legislation limitation, organizational limitations, but the potential is here. And people who have worked on that show that it's absolutely extremely efficient. So we can be a problem solver, we can be a privileged observer, we can be engaged early with investigators, and here we've got really value-added information and insights. So we can be more effective in trying to answer these questions. This famous question, who, what, where, what means why, how, and when. And obviously that's the logical segue. It brings this aspect of we should try to be less reactive and more proactive in forensic science. So we should try to apply a more holistic approach and be interested in the study of crime phenomena. And it's where forensic intelligence started, really. I mean, and my colleagues in Switzerland, had fantastic results, not only academically, but also in application in a lot of different police forces. And it's a fantastic tool, not necessarily to catch up the criminal, but to disrupt, deter, or prevent criminal activities. Now, if you look at all sorts of police mission statements in democratic societies, they all talk about disruption and prevention of crime. And it's where forensic science can have a huge impact. And politically, that can be very, very important, especially when you go and try to get budget for your services. So here you've got a definition of forensic intelligence, where intelligence is derived from traces that, when extracted, analyzed, and interpreted, generate timely knowledge to support decision-making in policing and in the broader security context. Another thing which is, I think, should happen as well is try to be less SOP, standard operating procedures driven, and a bit more problem-orientated driven. So we should apply a more problem-orientated approach. So we have this professor of law at the University of Wisconsin, Herman Goldstein, who said, so he did a lot of work and policing. And he talked about police forces, and he said, we do not say to the police, here's the problem, deal with it. We say, here's the detailed code, enforce it. And by analogy, we could say that in dominant forensic science systems, we do not say to forensic practitioners, here's the problem, deal with it. We say, here's the detailed standard operating procedure, apply it. So again, I think I hope it's a clear point that it's not necessarily effective, and we should try to become more problem-orientated. Now, this is an example of a problem-orientated approach. And I'm glad I'm just here after Angeline, because it's really about the drug problem. So in Australia, we have a drug problem like in most countries around the world. And you can look at the drug problem from a very traditional way. So you've got law enforcement agencies. They look after drug seizures, do some analysis, have some results, can lead to some prosecution. The laboratory, they have drug specimen, they do chemical profiling, results. Again, they may do some links between different cases, but again, it's case-to-case links. You've got health organizations, they are interested in the drug user survey, talk about harm minimization. They look at the results to do this. And then obviously you've got academia, where some people have been interested in looking at the data, especially from crypto market or social media, can do some analysis, get some results, and some publication. Now the problem, all of this happens in kind of almost siloed way and in a reactive approach. Now, I think the big challenge here is to turn that a bit around and try to get the illicit drug problem in the middle, and then look at the problem from a different angle, and then try to combine all this information. So for example, this is what you would have in a typical forensic drug laboratory. So you are focused on illicit drug seizures, you do all sorts of analysis, and so on. But you've got data coming from police. You have data coming from crypto market, what is being sold and so on, what is being bought in the crypto market. You have epidemiological data from wastewater analysis. So you can have some ideas of what happens when you have a music festival in town. What's the difference between an affluent suburb compared to a poorer suburb? Is the drug consumed being different? And obviously you've got surveys, taken from users. And the last one, do some kind of analysis, for example, of used paraphernalia or used syringes content. Now, each of these single angles are very incomplete. They all have their own biases. But when we put all that together, then we start to have a better view of the problem. Now, we haven't solved the problem, but at least we are better informed. And it's what it's all about in terms of problem-oriented approach. And I think it's a space where forensic science has a huge impact, or can potentially have a huge impact. So we've been doing a lot of that work at UTS, especially with Mary Moraleto in drug intelligence. But that can be, we can change the drug problem to another problem. It's just that we managed to get all that, but we could have, any, organized crime, counterfeits, child pornography, and all that. You can change and get the same sort of approach, or very similar approach. So my time is almost up. My conclusion here is really, I think there is a need for a change. So the world we live in is rapidly changing. So we really need to think deeply about the dominant model of forensic science we have. We have to think carefully about especially the role of the trace and the role of problem solving. And then obviously the role of the laboratory, the role of the scientist, the business processes, training and education. At the end of the day, a lot of our problems probably could come from a problem in education. If we've got the right people rightly educated in the right framework, we have already solved a lot of our problems. Research and development, obviously, rethink almost everything. And now the question I have is, are we proactive enough about it? Or will we be forced by others? And I think we have to be careful, because I'm not so sure that as a whole community, we are really proactive about that. Now, if we unpacked a bit some of what I said, first, what I tried to explain to you was that forensic science is primarily a historical science. Under the clue paradigm, it's a science on its own right, with an object of study, and the object of study is the trace, which has information, is an information vector about past event or a series of past events. It's a science with a method, so it's problem-oriented method, and it's science with fundamental principles. So presence and activity leaves traces requiring detection, recognition, and interpretation in context. So we can support decision-making at trial, we can contribute to investigation, we can connect to policing, we can bring knowledge on crime, illicit markets, and on a variety of mechanisms that cause harm to society. And we need to be more engaged in developing the right questions. If we don't ask the right questions or don't help people to ask the right questions, we can't get the right answers. It's as simple as that. Now, it's a major challenge, a major agenda, and not an easy one. And I think to do that properly, we need operations, education, research to become more collective and interdisciplinary. So it's why it's very important to have a meeting such as this one.